Widowed Homesteader was cast out by her in-laws. Until an Apache chief claimed her as wife, she lost her husband to a fever and her home to his family in the same week. But the desert would teach her that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. The McKenna Ranch stretched across the Texas plains like a promise that had forgotten how to keep itself. Sarah stood on the porch where she had kissed her husband goodbye for the last time, watching Thomas McKenna load her wedding china into the back of his wagon with the careful precision of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. "You got no business here anymore, girl." His voice cut through the October wind like a blade through leather. "James is dead 3 weeks now, and this land don't belong to no barren woman." Sarah's fingers tightened around the porch railing, the wood smooth from years of James's hands gripping it the same way. She had scrubbed that wood, painted those shutters, planted the roses that now bloomed wild and untended by the front gate. But Thomas McKenna saw none of that labor, none of that love made manifest in sweat and hope. "The deed has James's name on it," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the wind that pulled at her black morning dress. "His name and mine." Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only the cold satisfaction of a man who had waited 26 years to speak his mind. "Papers don't mean nothing when there's no son to carry on the name. You're 26, Sarah, and your belly's been empty 3 years running. That tells us everything we need to know about what the good Lord thinks of this." The words hit her like fists, but she had learned to absorb such blows in the weeks since the fever took James. The McKenna family had circled her grief like vultures, picking at her sorrow with their questions about inheritance and bloodlines and God's will. She understood now that they had always been waiting for this moment, for James to die young and childless, leaving them free to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Margaret McKenna emerged from the house, carrying Sarah's hope chest, the one James had carved for their first anniversary. The older woman's face showed no mercy, no recognition of the night Sarah had sat up nursing her fevered son through the winter flu, or the way Sarah had held James's hand as the consumption ate him alive, whispering prayers until her voice gave out. "You can take what's in this chest," Margaret said, setting it down with deliberate force. "Your dresses, your mother's Bible, whatever trinkets James bought you in his foolishness. But the house stays, the land stays, and the cattle stay. This is McKenna property built by McKenna hands." Sarah looked at the chest, at the careful roses James had carved into its lid during the long winter evenings when his cough was still just a tickle in his throat. Inside lay the remnants of a life she had thought would last forever. Her mother's wedding ring, letters from her sister in Missouri, the blue dress James had loved to see her wear on Sundays. "Where am I supposed to go?" The question escaped her before she could stop it, revealing a vulnerability she had sworn not to show these people. Thomas adjusted his hat, a gesture she had seen James make 1,000 times, and for a moment the resemblance between father and son was so sharp it took her breath away. But where James's eyes had held warmth, Thomas's held only the cold arithmetic of survival. "That ain't our concern anymore. You got kin back east, don't you?" "Tommy went back where you belong." But Sarah had no kin, and Thomas knew it. Her parents were dead, her sister married to a man who had made it clear that widowed relatives were not welcome in his household. The McKennas had known this when they started their campaign to reclaim the ranch, had counted on her isolation the way a hunter counts on a wounded deer's exhaustion. The wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard like ghosts fleeing a funeral. In the distance, the red rocks of the canyon country caught the dying light, painting the horizon the color of dried blood. Sarah had always found those rocks beautiful, mysterious, but James had taught her to fear them. "Apache country," he would say when she asked about riding out to explore. "No place for a white woman. They'd as soon scalp you as look at you." Now, as she watched the McKennas load her life into their wagons, those red rocks seemed to call to her with a voice she had never heard before, wild and wordless and free. Young Peter McKenna, James's nephew, emerged from the barn leading her mare, Stella. The boy avoided her eyes, but she saw the shame in the set of his shoulders. He had always been kind to her, had even cried at James's funeral. But kindness, she was learning, was a luxury the McKenna family could not afford when property was at stake. "You can't take Stella," Thomas said when he saw Sarah step toward the horse. "That mare was bred from McKenna stock. She stays with the ranch." Something broke inside Sarah then, something that had been bending for weeks under the weight of their cruelty. Stella had been James's wedding gift to her, chosen not for her bloodline, but for her gentle temperament and steady gait. Sarah had trained her herself, had whispered secrets in her ears during the long rides across the plains when a loneliness threatened to swallow her whole. "James gave her to me," Sarah said, and her voice carried a new edge, sharp as winter wind. "James gave you a lot of things," Margaret replied. "Don't mean you earned them." The insult hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah felt her face burn, felt the familiar sting of tears threaten behind her eyes. But she would not cry in front of these people. She had cried enough over James's grave, had poured out her grief into the red earth until she thought her heart might run dry. What remained now was something harder, something that would not break so easily. She walked to the hope chest and lifted it, surprised by how light it felt, how little remained of a life that had once felt so full. The weight of her loneliness was greater than the weight of her possessions, and that truth settled into her bones like winter cold. "I'll need supplies," she said. "Food, water, ammunition." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What for?" "For whatever comes next." She saw him calculate the cost of generosity against the risk of appearing heartless before his neighbors. The McKennas had a reputation to maintain, after all. Good Christian folk didn't send a woman into the wilderness empty-handed, even if they had driven her to that wilderness themselves. "Peter," Thomas called to his nephew, "load up some hardtack and jerky. Enough for a week's travel." He paused, then added with grudging fairness, "And fill her canteen." As Peter moved to obey, Sarah caught his arm gently. The boy looked up at her with James's eyes, and she saw the question there, the same question she had been asking herself since the fever took her husband. "Why don't you fight them?" Peter whispered. James would have fought. Sarah looked across the ranch, at the cattle bearing the McKenna brand, at the house where she had loved and lost, and learned that happiness was always borrowed, never owned. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the red rocks, riding the thermals with an ease that spoke of absolute freedom. "Sometimes, Peter," she said softly, "the only way to win is to walk away." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she believed them. The rifle James had taught her to shoot hung heavy across her back, and her hands remembered the weight of it, the kick of it against her shoulder when she had defended their chickens from coyotes. She was not as helpless as the McKennas believed, not as broken as they hoped. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls, painting the sky the color of fresh blood and old gold. Soon the stars would come out, cold and distant as the family that was casting her into the night. But stars, Sarah remembered, had guided travelers long before there were roads or fences or deeds written on paper. She lifted the hope chest and walked toward the gate, feeling the eyes of the McKenna family on her back like brands. Behind her, Stella nickered softly, the sound full of longing and confusion. Sarah did not look back. Looking back, she had learned, was a luxury for people who had somewhere safe to return to. The desert stretched before her like an ocean of silence and sage, vast enough to swallow a woman whole, or wide enough to remake her into something the McKennas had never imagined possible. As she walked, the wind carried the scent of rain from the distant mountains, and somewhere in the Red Rock canyons, an Apache war chief named Nailnish watched a lone woman walk into the gathering darkness, carrying herself like someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The desert had no mercy for the unprepared, and Sarah McKenna was learning this truth with every burning step across the Alkali Flats. 3 days had passed since she left the McKenna ranch. 3 days of walking south toward the Red Rock country, where the maps ended and the legends began. Her water was nearly gone, her lips cracked like dried leather, and the hope chest that had seemed so light when she lifted it from the porch now felt heavy as a coffin. She had rationed the hardtack and jerky Peter had given her, making each bite last, but hunger gnawed at her belly with the persistence of an old wound. The rifle across her back had grown heavier with each mile, its weight a constant reminder of James's voice teaching her to shoot. Squeeze, don't pull. Breathe out slow. Respect the gun, and it'll respect you. But the desert respected nothing and no one. The sun climbed toward noon like a judge ascending his bench, ready to pronounce sentence on all living things. Sarah pulled her worn shawl over her head and pressed on, following a game trail that wound between stands of prickly pear and barrel cactus. Her shoes, made for walking on wooden floors and packed earth, had begun to split at the seams, letting in sand that rubbed her feet raw. She thought of James as she walked, but not the James who had died gray-faced and gasping in their marriage bed. Instead, she remembered the man who had courted her with wildflowers picked from these same hills, who had promised her a life as wide and free as the Texas sky. He had been 24 when they married, full of plans and dreams, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having failed at anything important. "We'll build something here," he had told her on their wedding night, gesturing toward the window that faced the red rocks. "Something that'll last. Our children will grow up seeing those mountains every morning, knowing they belong to something bigger than themselves." But the children never came, and James's dreams had died with him, leaving Sarah to face the bigger truth, that belonging was not something you inherited or built, but something you had to fight for every single day. A buzzard circled overhead, patient as death itself. Sarah forced herself to look away from its lazy spirals and focus on the ground ahead. Somewhere in this wasteland, there had to be water. The game trail she followed suggested as much, worn smooth by the hooves and paws of creatures that knew secrets she was only beginning to guess at. The sound reached her ears like a prayer answered, the whisper of water moving over stone. She followed the sound through a gap between two towering rocks and found herself standing at the edge of a small oasis. A spring bubbled up from deep in the earth, creating a pool no bigger than a washtub, surrounded by green grass and cottonwood trees that seemed impossible in this place of endless brown and red. Sarah fell to her knees at the water's edge and drank deeply, not caring that the water tasted of minerals and it was cool and clean and life itself flowing into her parched body. She splashed her face, washing away 3 days of dust and despair, and for the first time since leaving the ranch, allowed herself to believe she might survive this. The shade of the cottonwoods felt like a benediction. She set down the hope chest and rifle, then lay back against the trunk of the largest tree, closing her eyes and listening to the gentle music of the spring. Peace settled over her like a blanket, and she felt her body begin to relax for the first time in weeks. That was when she heard the horses. The sound came from the north, muffled by the rocks, but unmistakable, the steady rhythm of unshod hooves on stone. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle. James's stories flooded back to her, tales of Apache raiders who could move across the desert like ghosts, appearing and disappearing without warning. But exhaustion had settled deep in her bones, and when she tried to stand, her legs betrayed her. The world tilted sideways, dark spots dancing at the edges of her vision. She managed to sit up, to get her hand around the rifle stock, but even that small effort left her gasping. The horses grew closer. She could hear them now, 3 or 4 animals moving with the easy confidence of creatures that knew this country. Sarah tried again to stand, managed to get to her knees, but then the desert heat and 3 days of poor food and little water took their toll. Darkness rushed up to meet her like flood water, and she collapsed beside the spring where her life had briefly seemed possible again. She woke to the smell of smoke and cooking meat, and the strange sensation of shade where no shade should be. A blanket had been draped over her body, woven with patterns she didn't recognize but beautiful in their geometric precision. Someone had moved her into deeper shadow and built a small fire nearby where strips of meat dried on wooden stakes. Sarah sat up slowly, her head spinning, and found herself looking into the darkest eyes she had ever seen. The man crouched across the fire from her was Apache, no question about that, but not the savage from James's stories. His face was weathered by wind and sun, marked by old scars that spoke of battles survived rather than cruelty inflicted. His hair hung long and black past his shoulders, held back by a band of worked silver, and he wore buckskin clothing decorated with beadwork that caught the firelight like captured stars. He watched her with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting, his hands steady on his knees. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and clear, his English careful but precise. "You were dying," he said simply. "The sun would have killed you before evening." Sarah's hand moved toward the rifle, but it was no longer beside her. She found it propped against a rock 10 feet away, close enough to reach, but far enough to make it clear that aggression would be unwise. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice still rough from thirst. "I am called Nailnish," he replied, "war chief of the Chiricahua. This is our water, our country." He gestured toward the spring without taking his eyes off her. "But water belongs to all living things when death is near." Sarah studied his face, looking for the cruelty James had warned her about, the savage hunger for white blood that filled the stories told around ranch fires. Instead, she saw intelligence, curiosity, and something that looked almost like sadness. "Your people," she said carefully, "they kill white settlers." Nailnish nodded, accepting the accusation without defensiveness. "White soldiers kill Apache children. White miners poison Apache water. White ranchers drive cattle over Apache graves." He fed a stick to the fire, watching the flames consume it. "We kill to protect what remains of our world. You kill to take what was never yours." The truth of it hit her like cold water. Sarah had grown up hearing only one side of the story, the version where brave pioneers brought civilization to empty wilderness. She had never considered that the wilderness might not have been empty, that civilization might be a word with different meanings depending on who spoke it. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Nailnish was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the hope chest, to the wedding ring that still circled her finger. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was still working out the answer himself. "You carry yourself like someone who understands loss," he said finally. "Like someone who knows that the worst enemies are sometimes the ones who share your blood." The words struck home with painful accuracy. Sarah felt tears threaten again, but this time she didn't fight them. Here, beside an Apache fire in the middle of nowhere, with a man who should have been her enemy, she finally felt safe enough to let them fall. He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. When he unfolded it, Sarah saw strips of dried meat, darker and more fragrant than any jerky she had ever tasted. He offered it to her without ceremony, and she took it with hands that trembled only slightly. The meat was rich and slightly sweet, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify. As she ate, Nailnish told her about the spring, how his people had used it for generations, how it had saved Apache lives during the harsh summers when other water sources failed. His voice was like the sound of the wind through stone, measured and deep, carrying stories that went back further than any white man's claim to this land. "My wife," he said eventually, his eyes distant with memory. "She used to bring our children here in summer. They would play in the water while she gathered roots for medicine." He paused, feeding another stick to the fire. "The cavalry found them here 5 summers ago. My wife died protecting our daughter. The soldiers took the children to the reservation school, where they cut their hair and beat them for speaking Apache." Sarah felt the weight of his loss settle between them like smoke. She understood now why he had helped her, not from kindness, but from recognition. They were both people who had been carved hollow by other people's cruelty, both learning that survival sometimes meant accepting help from unexpected places. "Where are your children now?" she asked softly. "Gone," he said simply. "The school calls my son Robert and my daughter Mary. They teach them that their father is a savage, that their mother died because she was too stupid to surrender. His hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his knees. When I see them, they look through me like I am already dead. Sarah reached across the fire, her fingers brushing his wrist before she could think better of it. His skin was warm and scarred, human in a way that made all of James's stories about Apache monsters seem like the lies they had always been. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it in a way that went deeper than politeness. Nailnish looked down at her pale fingers against his dark skin, but he didn't pull away. "Sorrow is a luxury," he said. "It changes nothing. But anger can keep you alive long enough to change everything else." As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky the color of old wounds, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For weeks, she had carried her grief like a stone, heavy and cold and useless. But sitting here beside Nailnish's fire, eating food he had prepared with his own hands, she felt that stone begin to crack. Maybe anger was exactly what she needed. The stars came out one by one, bright as scattered salt against the darkness. Nailnish added wood to the fire, and the flames danced higher, casting moving shadows on the canyon walls that looked like the ghosts of all the people they had lost. "Sleep," he told her as he spread another blanket on the ground. "Tomorrow we will talk about what comes next." But Sarah lay awake long into the night, listening to the spring's quiet song and wondering if what came next might be something neither of them could imagine. 2 months in the high country had changed Sarah McKenna in ways that went deeper than the sun-darkened skin or the calluses on her palms from working hides. She moved differently now, with the quiet efficiency she had learned from watching Nailnish's people. No wasted motion, no energy spent on anything that didn't serve survival or beauty or the simple joy of being alive. The Apache camp nestled in a hidden valley where ancient cottonwoods grew beside a creek that ran clear and cold even in the harsh months of late autumn. Sarah had learned to read the rhythms of this place. When the women gathered acorns, when the men hunted, when the children practiced with their small bows in the clearing by the water. She had learned to speak enough Apache to understand the jokes the grandmothers told while they worked, and enough to know when they spoke about her. Some called her Ghost Woman for the pale color of her skin. Others called her Broken Wing for the way she had arrived, collapsed, and near death. But Nailnish's grandmother, ancient and sharp-eyed as a hawk, had given her a different name. Shurjari Bahi, she returns home. It was this name that the children used when they asked her to tell them stories about the white world beyond the mountains. Sarah sat now beside the creek, grinding acorns in the stone matate that Nailnish's sister-in-law had taught her to use. The work was rhythmic, meditative, and it gave her hands something to do while her mind wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Across the camp, Nailnish worked on his horse's bridle, his fingers moving with the same careful precision she had seen him use to tend her wounds when she first arrived. They had not spoken of love, but it lived between them nonetheless. In the way he saved her the choicest portions of meat when the hunters returned, in the way she had learned to read the weather in his eyes before storms came. It was a love built from shared silence and small kindnesses, from the recognition that they had both been cast out by their own people and found in each other something worth protecting. "The scouts bring word from the fort," said Goyakla, Nailnish's war leader, as he approached the fire where the women worked. His English was rougher than his chief's, heavily accented but clear enough. "Blue soldiers are asking questions about a white woman, offering money for information." Sarah's hands stilled on the grinding stone. She had known this day would come, had felt it approaching like distant thunder. The white world would not let her disappear so easily into the red rocks and sage. There would be consequences for choosing the Apache way, for becoming something the McKennas and their kind could never understand or forgive. "How much money?" asked Ishtan, one of the younger warriors, his tone carefully neutral. $50, Goyakla replied, "and safe passage to the reservation for whoever brings her in." The sum hung in the air like smoke from signal fire. $50 was more money than most Apache had ever seen, enough to feed a family through a hard winter or buy ammunition for a year's worth of hunting. Sarah understood the calculation that was taking place in the minds around the fire, the cruel mathematics of survival that left no room for sentiment. "She is under my protection," Nailnish said quietly, not looking up from his work on the bridle. "That protection extends to anyone who would harm her." The words were spoken gently, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. Goyaklin nodded and moved away, but Sarah caught the glance he exchanged with Ishtan, a look that said the matter was far from settled. That evening, as the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of nightfall, Nailnish found Sarah sitting alone by the creek, watching the stars reflect in the dark water. He settled beside her without invitation, close enough that she could smell the wood smoke in his hair and the leather oil on his hands. "You are afraid," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Shouldn't I be?" She picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in her palm, feeling its weight and texture. "Your people don't want me here. My people will never stop looking for me." "And you?" She stopped, unable to finish the thought. "What about me?" Sarah threw the stone into the water, watching the ripples spread outward in perfect circles. "You have enough troubles without adding a white woman to them. I bring nothing but danger to your camp." Nailnish was quiet for so long that she wondered if he had decided she was right. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision made long ago and only now being spoken aloud. "My first wife," he said, "was chosen for me by the elders. Good Apache bloodline, strong family, all the proper ceremonies. We were married 12 years. She bore me 4 children and died, defending them from white soldiers." He paused, his fingers finding hers in the darkness. "I honored her, provided for her, grieved her properly. But I never chose her." Sarah felt her breath catch. His hand was warm against hers, calloused from years of holding weapons and reins and the weight of leadership. She had been married 3 years to a good man who had loved her in his way, but she understood now that there was a difference between being loved and being chosen, between being someone's wife and being someone's willing equal. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that some risks are worth taking." He turned to face her fully, and in the starlight she could see the scars that marked his chest and shoulders, the price he had paid for being Apache in a world that wanted his people dead or disappeared. "I am saying that when a man has lost everything he thought mattered, sometimes the spirits send him a chance to build something new." Before she could respond, the sound of horses echoed across the valley, many horses moving fast and hard through the darkness. Nailnish was on his feet instantly, his hand on the knife at his belt. Across the camp, Sarah could see figures moving in the shadows as the Apache prepared for whatever was coming. A scout materialized out of the darkness, breathing hard from a fast ride. He spoke rapidly in Apache, and Sarah caught enough words to understand the essence of his message. Soldiers, many of them, camped 2 valleys over and asking questions about a missing white woman. Nailnish listened without interruption, then turned back to Sarah. His face was calm, but she could see the war chief in his eyes now, the man who had survived 30 years of fighting an enemy that outnumbered him 10-1. "They will be here by morning," he said. "You must decide now what you want your life to be." Sarah stood, brushing the dust from her Apache-style dress, the buckskin and beadwork that Nailnish's sister had given her when her own clothes wore out. The garment felt right on her body in a way her corset and petticoats never had, allowing her to move and breathe and exist without constant discomfort. "If I go with them," she said, testing the words, "what happens to you?" "We disappear into the deep country. We survive, as we always have. And if I stay..." Nailnish's smile was sad and fierce at the same time. "Then we fight. And some of us will die. And you will carry that weight for the rest of your life." The choice stretched before her like a canyon too wide to cross, with darkness on both sides. But as Sarah looked around the camp, at the children sleeping peacefully in their mother's arms, at the elders sharing stories around the central fire, at the young men checking their weapons with the casual competence of people who had never known peace, she realized that the choice had already been made somewhere in her heart during the long weeks of learning to belong. "Teach me to fight," she said. And in the distance, carried on the night wind like a wolf's howl, came the sound of cavalry trumpets calling reveille. Dawn came like Judgment Day, painted in shades of red that seemed to bleed from the canyon walls themselves. Sarah stood with Nailnish on the ridge above the hidden valley, watching dust clouds rise in the distance where two groups of riders approached from different directions. The cavalry came from the north, their blue uniforms dark against the pale morning sky, while from the east rode a smaller group that made her heart clench with recognition. The McKennas, led by Thomas himself, come to witness her humiliation or her rescue. 23 soldiers, Nailnish said quietly, lowering his field glasses, and 5 civilians. They fly the white flag, but their weapons are ready. Sarah adjusted the rifle strap across her shoulder. Not James's old gun, but a newer Winchester that Nailnish had taught her to use with deadly accuracy during the weeks of preparation. Her hands were steady now, her aim true, and she carried herself like a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to find peace was to be willing to fight for it. "They'll want to parley," she said, watching the two groups converge in the flat ground below the valley entrance. "Talk first, then threats, then blood if the talking doesn't work." Nailnish nodded, his face grim. "That is the white way. Promise peace with one hand while the other reaches for the gun." But Sarah had learned enough Apache wisdom to know that her people held no monopoly on violence. The warriors hidden in the rocks around them were some of the finest fighters the desert had ever produced, men who could kill with arrow or knife or bare hands, then vanish in a country that would swallow pursuing soldiers like sand swallowing water. If this came to shooting, the cavalry would learn why the Apache had survived 30 years of wars that were supposed to end them. A white flag appeared among the riders below, held high on a cavalry lance. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the man riding beneath it. Captain Morrison, the same officer who had presided over the army court that validated Thomas McKenna's claim to the ranch. Beside him rode Thomas himself, his face set in the righteousness of a man who believed God personally approved of his every decision. "They want to talk," Nailnish observed. "Then we'll talk." Sarah started down the steep trail that led to the valley floor, feeling the weight of history on her shoulders. Behind her, Nailnish followed, and beyond him came a dozen Apache warriors who moved like shadows given flesh, silent, deadly, and absolutely committed to their chief's decision to stand with the white woman who had become one of them. The two groups met in a circle of flat ground surrounded by towering red rocks, neutral territory where neither side could claim advantage. Captain Morrison dismounted first, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. He was a small man, made larger by his uniform and his certainty, the kind of officer who saw Indians as problems to be solved rather than people to be understood. "Mrs. McKenna," he called when Sarah stepped into view. "We've come a long way to bring you home." "This is my home," Sarah replied, and the words came out stronger than she had expected. Thomas McKenna spurred his horse forward, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Look at you," he spat. "Dressed like a squaw, living in sin with a savage." James must be spinning in his grave. Sarah felt the familiar sting of his words, but it was different now. Duller, less able to wound. She had learned from Nailnish's grandmother that shame was a weapon that only worked if you handed it power over yourself. "James is dead," she said simply, "and I'm not." Captain Morrison cleared his throat, reasserting control over the parley. "Mrs. McKenna, we understand you may have been coerced into the situation. Apache raids on white settlements are common, and captivity can affect a person's judgment. But you're safe now. We're here to take you back where you belong, where I belong." Sarah stepped forward, feeling the desert wind pull at her hair, now worn long and loose in the Apache style. "You mean back to a family that threw me out like spoiled meat? Back to a world where a woman's only value is the children she can bear and the men she can serve." The words hit their target. She saw Thomas flinch, saw Captain Morrison's jaw tighten with discomfort. These men had built their lives on the assumption that they knew what was best for everyone else, especially women. Sarah's defiance challenged the foundation of everything they believed about order and civilization and God's will. "You're talking nonsense," Thomas said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "This heathen has filled your head with lies, turned you against your own kind." Nailnish spoke for the first time, his voice carrying easily across the circle of riders. "No one has turned her against anything. She chose to stay. She chose to learn our ways. She chose to become my wife." The last word hit the white men like a physical blow. Sarah saw Captain Morrison's hand tighten on his pistol, saw the cavalry soldiers shift in their saddles. In their world, what Nailnish had just claimed was worse than murder. It was contamination, the pollution of white blood by savage hands. "That's impossible," Thomas whispered. "She's a Christian woman, a McKenna." "She wouldn't." "I would," Sarah said, cutting him off. "I did." She moved to stand beside Nailnish, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I chose this life, this man, this people. Not because I was forced to, but because here I found something I never had before, a place where my worth isn't measured by what my body can produce or what men think I deserve." Captain Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his campaign tan. "Mrs. McKenna, you don't understand what you're saying. This man is a wanted criminal. His band has killed white families, burned homesteads, stolen cattle. If you've allowed him to what?" Sarah's voice cut through his stammering like a blade. "To treat me as an equal? To teach me skills that might keep me alive? To look at me and see a woman instead of a womb that failed to produce sons?" The silence that followed her words was broken only by the wind moving through the canyon and the restless shifting of horses. Sarah could feel the Apache warriors watching from their hidden positions in the rocks, could sense their readiness to turn this parley into a battlefield if the soldiers made any hostile move. But it was Thomas McKenna who broke first. "You're not thinking straight," he said, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "The sun has addled your brain, or they've given you some kind of devil medicine. This ain't you talking, Sarah. This ain't the woman James married." "No," Sarah agreed, surprising him with her calmness. "This isn't the woman James married. That woman died the day you threw her off the ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back. What stands here now is someone who learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are." She reached for Nailnish's hand, felt his fingers close around hers with gentle strength. "I'm not your property, Thomas. I never was. I'm not the cavalry's problem to solve. And I'm sure not going back to a world where my value is measured by how quietly I accept whatever scraps men decide I deserve." Captain Morrison tried one last time. "Mrs. McKenna, if you stay here, we can't protect you. The Apache are a dying people. This land will be settled by whites, fenced and farmed and civilized. What you think you found here won't last." Sarah looked around the circle, at the red rocks that had stood here long before white men came and would stand long after they were gone, at Nailnish whose people had survived everything the government could throw at them, and were still here, still fighting, still choosing to live on their own terms. "Maybe it won't last," she said. "Maybe the cavalry will drive us deeper into the mountains. Maybe the government will hunt us until there's nowhere left to run. But right now, in this moment, I'm free. I'm loved for who I am, not what I can give to someone else. And if that's all I get, if that's all any of us get, then it's more than most people ever find." She turned to Captain Morrison, meeting his eyes directly. "You can tell whoever sent you that Sarah McKenna is dead. She died in the desert 3 days out from the ranch. What survived is something new, something that belongs to the red rocks and the clean air and the people who taught her that home is something you choose, not something you inherit." The captain's face cycled through frustration, anger, and finally a grudging respect. He had seen enough of the frontier to recognize genuine conviction when he encountered it, even when that conviction contradicted everything he had been taught to believe. "This is your final word?" he asked. "It is." Captain Morrison looked at Thomas McKenna, who sat his horse like a man who had witnessed the collapse of everything he thought he understood about the natural order of things. "We can't force her," the captain said quietly. "She's speaking of her own free will. The law doesn't require us to rescue someone who doesn't want rescuing." Thomas's face worked with emotions he couldn't name. "She's family," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "No sararibla. I never was. I was just someone James loved who happened to survive him for a while." The parley broke up slowly, with handshakes and careful courtesies that meant nothing and changed nothing. The cavalry would report back that Sarah McKenna had been offered rescue and refused it. Thomas McKenna would return to his ranch and tell his neighbors that his daughter-in-law had been lost to Apache savagery, confirming everything they already believed about the dangers of the frontier. But as the dust clouds retreated toward their separate horizons, Sarah felt something settle in her chest that she had never experienced before, the deep satisfaction of a choice freely made and fully owned. She was no longer Sarah McKenna, the barren widow who couldn't hold onto her dead husband's property. She was Shurji Bahi. She returns home, wife to a war chief, and mother to a people who had taught her that family was something you created, not something you were born into. That evening, as the Apache celebrated their bloodless victory with songs and stories around the central fire, Nailnish found Sarah sitting apart, looking up at the stars that wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling beside her. Sarah thought about the question, weighing it against the sound of children's laughter and the warmth of belonging she felt in this hidden valley. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the McKenna ranch went on without her, and white settlers continued their push westward, and the government continued its patient work of erasing the Apache from existence. But here, in this moment, beside this man who had chosen her, as she had chosen him, Sarah McKenna had finally found something worth fighting for. "None," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Above them, the stars blazed like scattered diamonds against the velvet darkness, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow blessing them nonetheless. The desert wind sang its ancient song through the canyon walls, carrying the scent of sage and freedom and the promise that some things, love, choice, the human need for dignity, were stronger than all the armies. In the red rocks of Apache country, a white woman had found her true home at last.